This interview of Dr. Robert A. Traina by the members of the Department of English Bible of Asbury Theological Seminary marks the retirement of Dr. Traina from the faculty of Asbury Theological Seminary. The department is convinced that a taped conversation with Dr. Traina will be of immeasurable value for future students of English Bible and for those who will explore the history of English Bible, that is, the so-called inductive Bible study method in the tradition of the Biblical Seminary in New York. No one is more competent to discuss the history of the English Bible movement or the challenges that face inductive Bible study today than Dr. Traina. He matriculated into the Biblical Seminary in New York in the fall of 1943. There he excelled as a student, and the seminary administration and faculty, recognizing his extraordinary gifts in English Bible, hired him as a member of the faculty immediately upon his graduation from the Biblical Seminary. During his years of teaching at the Biblical Seminary, Dr. Traina became troubled at the lack of integration between English Bible and traditional exegesis. He judged that English Bible, as it was being taught at the Biblical Seminary, was not sufficiently comprehensive and explicit to teach students effectively. Out of this concern, Dr. Traina expanded and sharpened the method of English Bible. He developed it into an organized and comprehensive approach, combining the unique features of the inductive method as it had been taught over the years with the insights and tools of traditional exegesis. Dr. Traina set forth his approach to inductive Bible study in his book, Methodical Bible Study, published in 1952. In the early 1960s, the Biblical Seminary in New York experienced a time of transition, resulting in a radical change in the nature of the seminary itself. At this time, Dr. Traina concluded that he could best minister elsewhere, and in 1966 he accepted an invitation to join the faculty of Asbury Theological Seminary as a professor of English Bible. It is from this position that he has recently retired. It is therefore a great privilege for the English Bible Department, David Thompson, and myself, David Bauer, to discuss with Dr. Traina the history, character, and current state of inductive Bible study. Thank you, Dr. Traina, for meeting with us this afternoon. To begin with, we would like to explore something of the institutional history of the Biblical Seminary in New York, especially from the perspective of English Bible study. So we'll leave that with you as a starting point.
Let me say that no history of the institution has been written. Dr. Helen Garber, a colleague of mine, was in the process of writing the history. She was in contact with me about it, but she unfortunately contracted Alzheimer's disease and passed away. And I do not know the present status of the material that she gathered or manuscript that she might have been preparing.
When was she contacting you about?
She was contacting me, I would say, up to about 5 years ago, asking questions particularly with regard to the later years and what happened then. She was at the seminary when I arrived in 1943, so knew what had transpired in previous times and was particularly interested in the latter days. And I do not know the status of that material. I hope that perhaps we can get hold of it, and that would help us to bring us up to date on what transpired at the Biblical Seminary in New York up until I left there in 1966. The one book that does exist that gives some insight with regard to what occurred there is Charles Eberhardt's book, Eberhardt, The Bible in the Making of Ministers. And so I would direct people to that book until a more definitive statement is made, which I hope will be forthcoming in the future. My knowledge of what transpired prior to my arrival in 1943 is somewhat sketchy, and I'm not sure of the chronological sequence of the events to which I'll call attention. but let me emphasize certain highlights which help us understand what caused the development of the inductive approach by Wilbert Webster White, who was the founder of the Biblical Seminary in New York, although it wasn't called by that name initially, and became its first president. He was not president when I arrived on the scene, but I did get to see him, did not get to take courses from him, but I heard much about him from those who were intimately acquainted with his work. Wilbert Webster White took graduate studies at Yale University, where he came into contact with William Rainey Harper, and on the basis of his exposure to Harper's inductive approach to Hebrew, got the idea that perhaps an inductive approach to the biblical text would be the way in which students ought to be exposed to that text. Of course, the context in which this happened had to do with the fact that most Bible study, as is true now, in fact, was done on the basis of studying books about the Bible. And in those days, as is perhaps true to a certain extent nowadays, those books tended to emphasize higher critical approaches, and in some cases were somewhat negative toward the Scriptures and tended to undermine the authority of Scripture. And as a result, he was concerned about the lack of information that ministers had about the Bible, having gone through that kind of process in seminary. In fact, he engaged in some travels in order to get a reading as to where ministers were in the knowledge and study of Scriptures. And he discovered that the one thing that ministers lacked most of all in all of his travels, not only here but overseas, was a knowledge of the Bible and a knowledge of how to use the Bible in ministry. And so he came from those travels convinced of P.T. Forsyth's statement that ministers need to know the Bible better than any other book. And so his question then was, in founding the seminary, what kind of program can you set up in order to enable students to be exposed to Scripture and to come to know it not only cognitively but affectively and experientially, and be able to use it in various aspects of ministry as they went out to people. And he became convinced the approach ought to be then a direct one to the Scriptures themselves, as over against books about the Bible. In fact, he described the approach to the primary source as being inductive, and the reading of books about the Bible as being deductive, by which I gather he meant that in reading books about the Bible, one would read about conclusions that had been arrived at by the authors of those books, and perhaps take those conclusions to the text and be affected by them in interpreting the text. So he engaged in this kind of bifurcation, which, as I think will emerge in our discussion of what is happening currently, does not exist in our thinking. But in any case, in his thinking, that was the way in which to divide these two approaches. And the emphasis, as I indicated, was on the direct study of the text, which was inductive. And he took as his model the account of Scudder in his essay on the student Agassiz and the fish, of how that great ichthyologist, Agassiz, instead of lecturing to his students about fishes and what fish were like, etc., simply handed the student a fish and isolated that student and told the student to look at the fish, observe the fish. And periodically he would return and ask what the student had found, and then would encourage him, say, fine, keep on looking. And the student kept on looking. And that was the initiation to the whole process of studying fish in his course on the subject. And that became the model. In fact, that essay was handed out to every matriculant of the Biblical Seminary in New York as the model to be followed. As a result, when that was translated into the study of the Scriptures, the thing to do in studying the Scriptures was not to study books on methodology or books on any subject, but rather to go to the Scriptures themselves. So biblical courses were taught on the basis of a direct approach to the text itself. That direct approach to the text itself, given the lack of aptitudes with regard to the use of original languages, to his mind, had to involve in a major way the vernacular. And so the translations became a focus of the study, not to the exclusion of the original languages. I'll talk shortly about the bibliocentric curriculum, what it involved, but with a focus on the translations. And out of that process, various elements were drawn as to methodology. In effect, pieces of the jigsaw puzzle were drawn from that process out of the study of the text, presumably to be put together into a pattern of methodology that would enable a student to study for oneself. And by the way, that was the main goal in the whole process. And that is not to dish out applesauce or to dish out fish, but rather to encourage students to plant apple trees or to learn how to go fishing for themselves. So that was to be the outcome of the whole process. Now, in doing that, there were certain values, and by the way, I ought to add that perhaps the one area in which there was deviation from the direct approach to the text itself had to do with the influence of John Ruskin's essay on composition. We as students were encouraged to read that essay, which had to do with the laws of composition or the laws of structure, 9 laws as Ruskin had them. Laws which Ruskin drew from all art forms and even from nature itself. So we were encouraged to become aware of those and to look for those in the text as we observe the text. But other than that, the approach to methodology was through direct contact with the text itself. There were many values to that approach. And incidentally, I ought to say that the emphasis on the bibliocentric curriculum at the seminary involved spending 1/3 of one's entire seminary program in English Bible, plus 1 semester of each of the 6 semesters in the original languages. So one had a great exposure to the text and a variety of literary forms out of which to develop a methodology.
Excuse me, Bob, you mean 1 course each semester?
1 course each semester in the 6 semesters in the original languages, in addition to 1/3 of the program in English Bible. So you had a substantial amount of the courses in the curriculum devoted to biblical studies. And as I say, out of that grew the skills, presumably, that a student ought to have. The methodology that was developed was divided into 3 phases, with which we're familiar, although we've gone beyond them, namely observation, interpretation, and application. The great emphasis was on observation. And in fact, in every lesson, we as students were asked to observe a certain text and to be ready to report what we observed. And then beyond that, we were given what we would call interpretive questions to answer by professors. And we would have lessons as we've had here, and those lessons would be written, and we would become prepared to class to answer those questions. And the classes, by the way, were conducted in an experimental fashion. They were based primarily on question and answer. In fact, as I look back over my first lesson plans, they consisted of a series of questions that I asked of the class, which is the way my professors did it, and then the answers to those questions, which presumably we would draw out of the members of the class by some means, and if we couldn't, we would introduce certain elements that weren't seen by the class. So there was a great emphasis on observation. There were the questions given. We were not taught to ask questions ourselves, which posed certain problems in terms of this learning how to fish and growing apple trees, because there was a heavy reliance on what the professors asked. And so we did the observations, and then we answered the questions, and the answers to the questions were presumed to be somewhat intuitive. That is to say, the answers, the questions were really Socratic. They almost assumed that out of the mind would come the answers, assuming that the person had observed the text. That, I think, was the assumption. I'm drawing inferences from what happened. We didn't have many discussions of methodology as such, but that's what I gathered was behind what was done. There was no methodology set forth for answering the questions. Very often, questions about controversial matters, matters on which there were sharp differences of opinion, were avoided. And by the way, I might, by way of parenthesis here, indicate that the Biblical Seminary in New York was ecumenical in its approach. It had a basic creed which was very comparable to the Apostles' Creed in terms of its simply stating essentials. So its position was not really essentially confessional, and therefore it could be ecumenical. And the concept was that the church would be drawn together through the common study of the text. So if we all got together and studied the same text and shared our findings, these things, these procedures would draw us together. But in the process, when questions arose that involved differences between Baptists, for example, and non-Baptists, or what have you, those matters were somehow shunted aside because they would not contribute to the unity of the group as it approached Scripture. But in any case, to come back to the main discourse, the idea was that on the basis of this approach to the text, using these questions, and on the grounds of the observations, the answers would be forthcoming, and they would be discussed and shared, and the group would, in all likelihood, come to some kind of common understanding of what the text meant. The problem was, of course, that the process is not intuitive, not at least essentially intuitive, not that it doesn't involve intuition. And indeed, the whole person is involved in the process. So I would not want to downplay the non-cognitive aspects of personality in the process of study. But we did not deal with what we deal with here, namely the whole matter of inductive inferential reasoning and the use of evidence from various categories of evidence, including not only the biblical text itself, but extra-biblical sources, all as part of a single inductive approach. Now, this is where I tended to deviate from what Dr. White had indicated. And that came about, by the way, in my experience, in relation to my beginning to teach courses. I was teaching a course in Mark and Matthew. We had a combination course. We began with Mark and then picked up distinctive elements in Matthew. And in the middle of that course, when I asked the student to observe the text, the student raised the question, "What do you mean by observation?" And I almost fainted dead away when that question was asked, because we had presumably we'd been doing it
That's what
all
you've been
along.
doing.
And it was assumed that everybody knew what we meant by observation. I could understand asking, how is observation related to the other things we do? Because relationships were not emphasized in this approach, because what we found in looking at the text was sort of piecemeal. We had these pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, but we didn't stop to put them together. We didn't have all the pieces to begin with. So even if we had put them together, we would have had gaps in the jigsaw puzzle. But even the pieces we had, we didn't put together. So I was floored by this question, and I began reflecting on it. And I asked myself, now what do I mean by it, and what do I do when I observe the text? And that led to beginning to develop a syllabus with regard to this matter of methodology and this particular course. And I thought I might end up with a fairly brief syllabus on the subject. And once I began writing, the book evolved, so it wasn't as brief as I thought. But in any case, what I asked myself, as I've indicated, was what do I do? What do I look for example, when I observe the text, which then leads to the question, what are the components in the text about which I ought to be alert? Now, the laws of composition or the laws of structure certainly involve one of those components, although whether one used Ruskin's laws precisely or had other ways of describing them, they did constitute one of the important components, but there were other elements as well. So it's out of that I began developing the methodology in a fuller way. I might say that there, in relation to the statement you made, Dave, at the outset, that I perceived a dichotomy between what was happening in the English Bible courses, which, by the way, were sometimes taught by persons in disciplines which did not involve expertise in biblical studies, and which involved, of course, many students who knew nothing about the original languages, on the one hand, and then the courses in exegesis in the original languages on the other hand. Now, in the latter courses, we had a traditional kind of approach, although there was not much concern about spelling out a methodology, or perhaps even encouraging students to develop their own methodology. Essentially what happened was that we were given assignments on the outside, such as word studies and what have you, to do, and in class the professor lectured. So whatever methodology we learned essentially by the modeling done by the professor. But in any case, traditional exegesis was done there. But these two things were never brought together. And we as students, I don't know whether it was because of a lack of perception or the lack of courage or whatever, never raised questions along these lines. So there seemed to be this two-track approach to the study of scriptures on the basis that there are two roads, either of which will arrive at the same destination with regard to the study of scriptures. When I began reflecting on the student's question about observation, I realized that somehow these things had to be brought together. And so it is out of that process that I tried to work at a unified, integrated, and comprehensive approach that would include all of the elements involved in a valid approach to scriptures, and relate them to each other so that when a student was engaged in doing one thing in the process, for example, observing, that student knew why the observation was being done and how the observation related to the other parts of the study process. So it's that we aimed at doing in Methodical Bible Study. By the way, Dr. Howard Kist was the one who came closest to beginning at least an integration of English Bible with the original language approach. but he did not do so in a way that made us conscious of what was happening, or in a way that spelled out any concrete, orderly approach to the study of the text. So these are some of the components that were in the history, and which indicate both its values, and I would not by any means underestimate the value of what I learned from my experience from my teachers. And I had many teachers because I took not only the bachelor's degree with the heavy concentration on English Bible, as was involved in the requirements, but also a master's degree, which I went on to do further work in English Bible. So that I gained much from what was done there. I suppose the main thing would be had to do with an inductive attitude, an inductive spirit, an open-minded approach to the text. Dr. White talked about tabling presuppositions. And by the way, again, I urge you to look at Eberhardt's book in regard to that kind of thing. Indeed, he called the inductive approach a scientific approach, because he assumed that scientists who were true to their methodology would table their presuppositions and be guided solely by the evidence that they saw in the physical world. So he emphasized this matter of setting aside one's assumptions and being open to whatever the text says, and to being willing to change one's point of view if that was warranted by what the text said, as one allowed the text to speak for itself. So that that was a great emphasis, and had tremendous value, especially for someone like me who was somewhat dogmatic. As I went into my seminary training, I came from a background where we had the answers to questions, and where I was pretty firmly fixed. Indeed, had I been told in advance that I would change my mind in certain areas, I would have said firmly never. So this whole matter of an inductive mentality, an inductive attitude, an inductive approach that is absolutely essential to any inductive methodology which implements that kind of attitude and approach was a tremendous asset in the education I got. And then there were certain key elements that came through, such as I say, the matter of observing the text, the laws of structure or composition, key elements such as those, the modeling of questions, which then enable me to ask what kinds of questions are these, and how can I ask questions, learn how to ask questions, and how can I encourage students to learn how to ask questions. And then, of course, the exegesis that was done in the original language courses was very valuable. So there are a number of things that emerged from my experience, without which I would have done nothing. So I would not want to leave the impression that the experience is negative, essentially because it was not. But I felt there ought to be a development beyond what was being done. Let me go back to this matter of observation as it relates to the rest of the process. There was one professor who I think carried what was happening essentially to its logical conclusion, because he felt that he needed to have students make observations and report them. He would open every session with about 10 to 15 minutes of observations from the students. And we students would make our observations. And then once the observations were made, he would begin lecturing, and in the process not relate what he said to any of the observations we made, as if he had done his duty at the outset by asking us to make our observations, and once that was done, then he was going to interpret the text for us in the way in which the text ought to be interpreted. And he was an excellent exegete, and probably the best expository preacher I've ever heard. So he was excellent in what he did. But that, I think, indicates something of the dichotomy that was involved. Of course, the other extreme simply involved getting answers from students and then simply saying, well, I'm glad that this is your opinion, and this is your opinion, and this is your opinion, and these are the various opinions, and now you make your choice between these opinions. So there was a process of what I would call opining instead of interpreting. I think there's a difference between those two. And that tended to reflect the lack of emphasis on interpretation. Then as far as application was concerned, it was a matter of flying by the seat of your pants, I use that expression. Common sense took over, for example, and you knew that you ought not to interpret certain texts and then go out and do likewise. But no issues were raised as to the basis on which one makes judgments along the lines. And of course, some of the most knotty problems were not approached. Problems that perhaps involve matters of life and death, as would be true, for example, now of what the scriptures say about war or nuclear war or what have you. Those matters were not approached. They were controversial matters for one thing, and here we'd end up with radical differences of opinion, and that was avoided. So there was no methodology whatsoever with regard to application, and that had to be developed from scratch. I might tell one other episode, and then maybe you can react, and I can fill some things in. When I wrote Methodical Bible Study, Jane and I had no money to finance the book. We tried to get it published. I guess I wrote to about 30 publishers. And the answer from them was that the book was worthy of publication, but it would not sell. And so no one wanted to undertake it. So finally, Jane and I, having mimeographed 600 copies ourselves, collated all those pages, and tested it out in terms of whether people wanted it, decided on the basis of demand to publish it ourselves. But we had no resources to publish the book, so we would need to borrow the money in order to publish it if we were to publish it. And so we started looking around for someone from whom to borrow the money. We did so on faith, because our salaries then were extremely small, and I had no way whatsoever of repaying that loan with interest. This was a business proposition, unless the book sold. And as I was looking around for someone from whom to borrow the money, I did not receive support from my colleagues with regard, in the faculty, with regard to encouraging anybody to lend me the money. As a matter of fact, one of my professors is a fine person and had real insights into inductive study, indicated to me that there seemed to be very little correlation between what was done at Biblical Seminary in New York and what I had published in that book, which I think indicates something of the difference of approach that there was between what I was taught to do and what eventually came out of the process in terms of my reorganizing, reordering it, and elaborating on it. Another comment on the bibliocentric curriculum. I indicated the amount of Bible study that was involved in the curriculum. The bibliocentric curriculum was diagrammed in terms of two concentric circles. The inner circle involved the Bible and biblical studies. The outer circle was divided into sections of a pie, and those sections represented the various disciplines: church history, theology, preaching, etc. And there was an arrow going in each direction, from the Bible to these other disciplines on the basis of the study of the scriptures would inform these other disciplines and also bring these other disciplines under judgment, so that what accorded with the authority of the Word was correct and what didn't was not correct. And then the arrow went the other way. These other disciplines in turn illuminated the study of the scriptures. So that, for example, take the psychology of religion. The more one studied the psychology of religion, the more one ought to be able to get insights into the scriptures, given that other valid procedures were being used, obviously, in the process. And in addition to that concept involving the amount of Bible study and the constant movement back and forth between the scriptures and these other disciplines, there was supposedly integration on the basis of having professors from various disciplines, some in biblical studies, as for example I was when I took over from Dr. Carolyn Palmer when she retired, but others from other disciplines, Christian education, church history, preaching, etc. And the basis for that was that with all of these people involved in the teaching of the English Bible, they would naturally relate what they did constantly to English Bible, and indeed show how their disciplines grew out of and related to English Bible. So that would be part of the process of integrating English, the biblical studies. I say English Bible, that was the focus primarily also, although these other traditional exegesis courses were included, so that the scriptures would indeed become the center of the curriculum and function as such. So that was the essence of what was done in terms of the approach. And then, in addition, an inductive approach was carried over into other disciplines, so that students were made aware, for example, that in church history, if you want to find out what a certain person believed or what a certain movement represented, you went to the primary sources, to the text itself, and not to books about those persons or movements to find out what they really meant involved.
I have a question, Bob, on the basis of what you just said. If I might interject it at this point. How did your work and your book affect what was done by other instructors at the Biblical Seminary in New York who taught English Bible? Did it more or less carry the day eventually there? Or did you find that they were doing one kind of thing, the old thing, in their courses while you were working with a more integrated approach in your own?
As far as I know, what I did not change substantially what was being done by others. And we all recognized that there ought to be a variety of approach. You need to be and should not be uniformity. That methodology, after all, is an individual thing. Although there are certain principles that ought not to be violated, otherwise it becomes other than inductive study. So we all recognize that, but I don't think my colleagues were really convinced of what I was doing. Now, I'm not, I say I don't think because I didn't attend their classes, and so can't vouch for what happened in all the courses. But from the reactions I received, that was my estimate of the situation. And I would say that they continued doing essentially what they were doing, although as far as I know there was no attempt to indicate that what I was doing was wrong. It was simply one approach and different from the others, and that was to be expected. That's essentially what happened.
Was the essence of what you had done understood, you think? You mentioned this one gentleman apparently observed the nature, observed the difference. Did they realize the nature of the difference, you think?
The person didn't happen to be a gentleman. I deliberately left gender out.
I see.
But in any case,
the person.
The person. In any case, I think that's a very significant question. it is hard to understand what is involved simply by reading a book. And unless one goes through that process, including perhaps attending some classes where it was being done, I think it would be very difficult, given the mindset anyway, in other directions, to understand what was occurring. So I suspect that was one factor. Now, I'm not sure that there wasn't an interest in understanding or in changing. And I'm not sure that had there been understanding, there would have followed change. So I'm not sure at that point. But I am not satisfied in my own mind that there was a true grasp of what was involved. In fact, the criticism that was made of Methodical Bible Study by this person whom I alluded was that it was just a book about grammar. Which I think indicates a misperception of the book, because of course grammar is involved. How can you avoid grammar? You can't avoid grammar, but it wasn't. This isn't a book about grammar. It's much more comprehensive than that thing. So I think there was great difficulty, as I say, given the background and the mindset, and given the fact that Dr. White was not an organized person, and therefore was not concerned about developing an organized approach to study procedure. He was a sort of Renaissance man. In fact, what he called compositive Bible study involved relating, going back to the bibliocentric curriculum diagram, relating the scriptures to all other areas of knowledge. So he would bring in all sorts of things from philosophy and history and psychology and what have you, and relate what he found in the scriptures to those things. So he was a very broad-minded man, but if you look at his materials, outside of, say, his writings on Old Testament character studies, and his lessons on, say, the Gospel by John, where he went through the material and asked questions about the various portions of John, you'll find that they tend to be fragments here and there, without any attempt to put the pieces of the puzzle together with regard to methodology. So I don't really, with that kind of background, with that kind of model, I think it was very difficult to understand anything else. And I'm not sure that they ever came to an understanding.
That does sound like a heavy role of intuition, or assumed method, or maybe intuition. If I don't mean that precisely, or differentiating cognitive and non-cognitive processes, but intuitive in the sense of what arises naturally out of one's own background and experience. And it sounds like that.
Yes, I think W. White followed the pattern that you have in many exegetes who back away from laying out a methodology. I think that kind of thing is too rigid, too formalized, too individualistic, and do, because of their wide knowledge, almost follow a sort of sixth sense with regard to doing exegesis on a particular text as to what's relevant and how these things relate to each other, etc. Now, of course, matters such as inferential reasoning are always being done, but they're not so labeled. And, so these things are involved. But I think what happened with Dr. White, who was, as I say, a trained Hebraist, and who was an expert in exegesis, was that he assumed that others, and these fledgling seminary students, could do the same thing with the text that he could do with it. And of course, they were far from where he was. And I think this is illustrated by the extreme to which he carried this matter of inductive Bible study, because he said that to do inductive Bible study, all you need is a good translation and a dictionary, and go and sit under the tree and you could do inductive Bible study. Because that indicates the dichotomy he had in mind as between inductive study and deductive study. The latter involved other texts besides the scriptures. But now Dr. White might be able to make a sound and perceptive findings under a tree with a translation and with a dictionary. But I think when you send a student with a translation of the dictionary to sit under a tree to do Bible study, you're going to get into problems.
One of the differences is the secondary library that Dr. White brings in his head to the tree.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it.
Just perhaps to summarize, and you mentioned in your previous discussion about methods several features that impressed you that were positive matters, if I recall, the pervasively inductive approach, openness to the text. That sticks mainly in my mind. There may have been a couple other things you emphasized. Through your remarks, you talked about numerous methodological features that tended to slip through the cracks. They tended not to get lost in this rather diffuse presentation of, really non-presentation of method, and in the focus on observation. Can you just run down through the specifics of some of those parts of method that simply either didn't get talked about or tended to be assumed, just to summarize those?
Well, some things got assumed, but were not emphasized. For example, with regard to observation, what was emphasized, as I indicated, were the laws of composition, and the laws of structure. What was not emphasized in English Bible were such things as inflections of terms. There was some emphasis on syntax, but not very much emphasis on syntax. There was no emphasis whatsoever, as I say, on the raising of questions for yourself. There was no emphasis whatsoever on the use of extra biblical sources in arriving at answers to these questions, and no emphasis on the methodology for arriving at the answers to these questions. And as I say, in application, there was simply the leap from interpretation to application without any sense of a methodology.
No evaluation.
No evaluation.
No method in application.
No method in application.
Well, what about the use of context, of both immediate context and broader book context? There was concern, of course, for books as wholes within the discipline. Was there an implicit assumption that students would draw some evidence from context as well?
Yes, I think it was very implicit. I don't think there was any explicit attempt to show how, if a book is structured in a certain way, that would have a bearing on how you interpret individual parts. With a possible exception of Howard Kist, I happened to assist Howard Kist in what was called, I think it was a course on the Pentateuch. We were in a program that ran 3 years continually, and so had some short courses during the summer. And I had taken Old Testament book studies from another professor who did an excellent job in terms of making us aware of books as wholes, working with books as wholes, but did not relate what we found there to the interpretation of the parts. And this is, by the way, is part of the dichotomy between observing the text and then interpreting the text. It was almost assumed that if you observe the text, you would automatically bring your observations to bear on interpreting the text. And of course, that's not the case at all. Dr. Kist, I think, was one who moved most in the direction of demonstrating, for example, in Exodus, how the place of Exodus, how the place of the law in Exodus as a whole has a bearing on understanding the role of law. That kind of thing he worked with. So I think he moved in that direction more than anybody else whom I recollect anyway, whom I was aware at the time. But it was not drawn out as specifically as it has to. And I find with students that unless you pinpoint these things and make them conscious of what you're doing, and that it needs to be done, that you can't simply stop and say, well, I've now observed the book as a whole, and so I now move on to something else, and I never make use of don't make use of these findings I make. I think one has to make them conscious of those findings and how they're brought to bear on individual parts. That wasn't done sufficiently back there, as I think it needs to be done.
Now, just to follow up on that, if I may, the questions then that were asked of students, both in assignments and in actual class experience, were, I take it, then more observational questions and interpretive questions. That is to say, they tended to ask, what is there, over against what does what is there mean. Is that accurate?
Well, they included both. But as I tried to indicate, it was assumed that if you observe the text, you can then jump to the meanings of the text. So a student would be asked to interpret the meaning, say, of Paul's statements in Romans 6 with regard to dying to sin and rising in Christ to sin and the rising of Christ to a new life unto God. What does that mean? And the student would simply give an answer. And as I say, other students might give other answers. And those of us who were interested in the holiness tradition, by the way, and were concerned about how those statements related to entire sanctification or what have you, could never raise the questions that we wanted to raise about such matters, because those things were not delved into as to what the evidence was that one used and how one used the evidence and what the inferential reasoning was the basis for arriving at certain conclusions.
So what you're saying is, and the various answers, even contradictory ones that arose in the course of class discussion, were simply allowed to stand side by side. There's no attempt to work through them, no attempt to encourage students to talk these things out in terms of why they had come up with one answer over against another.
That's correct.
Bob, I was wanting to ask perhaps a transitional kind of question to another part, but it still relates to what we've talked about. Because we're interested not only in the history, but your history, and that's already been a part of our discussion. You've mentioned several persons. Beyond what you've said, would you care to, do you have anything you'd like to say about individual persons by name who whose contribution to you regard as significant? Episodes or things that you're conscious are with you and you're aware of that? You've mentioned Kist already a little bit. Are there other such persons that are really pretty keenly a part of who you are now?
Well, I had so many professors that it's hard to sort out what I learned where. So I'm not sure
that may not be possible.
They'll do justice to them. But the ones that stand out in addition to Dr. Kist would be Dr. Dean McKee, who was at the seminary for 35 years, first as a teacher and then as a dean. His name was Dean, but he was also dean, and then as president of the seminary for I think about 14 years. But his ability to see things as wholes was very, very impressive. Now, he came from the field of church history, and I took his course in church history, and he used the same approach with regard to church history. It's amazing how church history is transformed when you take the broad view as over against the narrow view, which takes church history apart in pieces, and in terms of events and places and dates and people, as over against seeing the broad movements in church history. So that I think impressed me greatly, and I remember the charts I used to make and all the arrows I used to use to indicate how things were connected with each other. So I think that impressed me greatly. What Dr. Carolyn Palmer did with regard to outlining materials, and I took the course in Romans from her and assisted her in Romans. In fact, I worked with individual students by the hour in helping them to work with, to do outlining, logical outlining materials. I think that impressed itself greatly on me as well. But I'm sure there were others who made significant contributions, especially with regard to a spiritual approach to the text, a reverential approach to the text. I think that's extremely significant in this whole process. So as I indicated, it was more than a cognitive matter with them. It was a matter of experience. It was a matter of one's relationship with God. And always the text was approached on that basis. And you had the feeling that the professors were talking out of personal experience with God and believed that God spoke through the text, and that the purpose of this entire exercise ultimately was to develop a fuller and a closer relationship with God, and more of a devotion to Him and to the ministry which we were called.
Was there more of a concern then for the spiritual meaning and application of passages than from the development of theology, biblical theology, on the basis of the study of the text?
Yes, there was no formal emphasis on biblical theology. There was no course in biblical theology. There weren't even courses in systematic theology. The only course that, although eventually I was instrumental in developing some of these courses, because I saw certain lacks. Of course, my own work at Drew was in the area of what was called Christian interpretation, which really amounted to biblical and systematic theology. As you know, in that period, there was a heavy emphasis on biblical theology and systematic theology, such as you had in Barton, Brunner, and Bultmann. So I saw certain needs there, but the assumption was that the theology of the Bible, that biblical theology would grow out of exegetical theology. At the moment you interpret the text properly, then you would see what the theology of the Bible is, and that there would be an almost automatic movement from that to systematic theology. Now, there was a course in the philosophy of religion, but nothing in systematics as such. And of course, I do think that there is an organic connection between those various elements, perhaps more than is sometimes seen when they're taught in separate courses, as if they have little connection with each other. But on the other hand, it was very difficult to explore biblical theological issues that transcended the area on which you were focusing in your particular course. You might be focusing on the Pentateuch, for example. How do you relate the Pentateuch to the prophets, or the Pentateuch to the prophets in the New Testament? So you were very limited as to what you could do. And as a result, I think the view of biblical theology and also systematics was somewhat truncated. But there, as I say, there were values in it that I think are missed when you have separate courses taught by separate professors who don't know what the professors do in other courses. And so there isn't integration. You see, this was part of the integrated process, really. And in fact, there were no courses in history and criticism of the text either. And we were expected to do in, say, an English Bible course or one of the traditional exegesis courses in original languages, we were expected to do what was to be done with regard to history and criticism. And so I did much more with criticism, say, in Old Testament book studies than I do here. Because here I assume it's assigned elsewhere, and my time is limited, so I might delve very quickly into something, as I do in relation to Exodus 6:3, the statement about Israel's not knowing God as Yahweh in the patriarchal period. I indicate something of the possible significance of that, but I simply say, well, you take a course in that, so I won't get into that further. So there were values to it, but also drawbacks. And so eventually, I was put on as chairperson of a committee to study the curriculum. And make suggestions for revisions on the curriculum. And I perceive that in the area of theology and in some other areas, such as pastoral care, that there needed to be more of a focus and emphasis. And as a result, I proposed reducing the English Bible curriculum somewhat. It was, as I recall, I suggested reducing it, by three courses or so, maybe 4 courses. Now, all of the courses were 2-hour courses. So in 30 hours, a third of the 90-hour curriculum, you had 15 courses, so it wasn't that you ended up with a small number of courses. And I thought some of these other areas ought to be developed further. And some of that was done. In fact, I was given the responsibility to teach a course on systematic theology, which I did in terms of focusing on certain theologians, key theologians. But by and large, there was resistance to moving away from the heavy course requirement in English Bible, because it was felt that somehow that would, moving away from that requirement would undercut the place of the Bible in the curriculum, and also the knowledge of the student about the scriptures and the development of methodology in relation to biblical studies.
Right, we have gone for just about an hour. This might be a good time for us to take a brief recess, a brief break. So we'll do that now and come back in about 5 minutes.